Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Meredith Wilson, who has over 20 years experience in intelligence, government, corporate, and international environments. She started Emergent Risk International with the belief that with the proper strategy and mindset, risk intelligence could add more than worry to an organization's bottom line. Meredith Wilson, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John.
Great to have you. The conversation I'd like to have with you today will unsurprisingly cover your expertise in corporate threat intelligence and risk. But before we get into this topic, could you share with us your perspective on our strategic landscape or the times in which we live?
Sure. First of all, that's a huge question, and
Yes.
it could go in 6 million different directions. But the way that I look at the times we live in is, one, things aren't actually as bad as people think they are most of the time. And what I mean by that is, it's kind of down to our overexposure to the internet and to this constant barrage of information we have coming at us all the time makes people feel anxious and makes people feel like things have never been worse than they are now. But the reality is actually quite different if you really look back in history. That said, we do have a lot of very, very complex problems to deal with right now. And in some ways, perhaps harder and more intractable than we've had in our memory. And I think part of that is because there are so many different people, so many different groups, and so many different things happening and influencing events all at once that it's very hard to set a strategy and fix anything, right? So I think we're also somewhat poorly equipped to manage these issues right now, partially because we are very, very politically divided, possibly more politically divided than we've been since World War II. And that makes it really hard to come to a consensus and set a strategy to start working out those problems.
Right. Yeah, that's a great perspective. So I think it might be helpful as well, Meredith, if you could give just like a super quick background on your career, which will help set the stage for some of the rest of our discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a reformed government person. I came out of the Defense Intelligence Agency, but really didn't spend a ton of time there. I was a very early kind of leap to the private sector at a time when most people that had gone government to private sector were 20, 25 years in the government. I had only a few before I moved over to the private sector, and I built the first sort of corporate intelligence program for ConocoPhillips. And from there, I also did some regulatory work there, and then jumped across to a smaller startup energy firm called Cosmos Energy, and took on their sort of political risk program. From there, I started my own company, and that was in 2014. That's Emergent Risk International. And we specialize in intelligence for private sector entities, primarily corporations, but we also work with nonprofits, multilateral agencies, and that type of thing.
Right. So when you're using the word intelligence for corporations, private organizations, and since you've got a national security intelligence background as well, do you make any distinction between the use of the word intelligence in a corporate context compared to a national security context?
I do when I'm talking about the discipline of private sector intelligence. And what I tell people is that being a private sector analyst is almost a completely different profession than being a government analyst. And so we even have a very popular training, our corporate intelligence analysis, tradecraft, and writing course that we've been doing since 2015. And the first module of that program is designed to help people really understand the difference between working intelligence in a national security context and working intelligence in a company. The other distinction that I make is that we are not super spooky spies. And that's a really important distinction, because the word intelligence, especially when we're overseas, is often, almost always, going to be associated with that. And we always want to make very sure that we're not putting people in danger by calling them intelligence analysts and things like that. And so oftentimes in an overseas environment, somebody might be called an information professional or a research analyst or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's dependent on the company. Really, it comes down to what other companies are comfortable with. We do have intelligence analysts in Singapore and in London and places like that. But there are other countries where we might not label them as such.
I see. So I've got a hypothesis here, and I guess I want to ask you two questions in order. But my hypothesis is that there is a blending is not the right word, but if you were to rewind time, 20 years ago, private organizations were perhaps not uninterested, but less interested in global dynamics. And that's just a really loose hypothesis. But so I guess I want to ask you is, over the last few years, are you observing like more interest in multinational companies in understanding and being able to react to global dynamics? Is that something that you're hearing from your customers?
I think, and this is, when we were talking earlier about common challenges facing companies and things like that. I think there's two answers to this. One, 20 years ago, I think most companies were interested because it was already post 9/11, and 9/11 really shifted the landscape for everybody, and probably in some ways kind of warped it for us in terms of, our threat perception being very singularly focused on terrorism. But even in the 90s, I think companies have always been interested. In the 90s, that was really the big globalization push. So they were interested, but they were really interested in, wow, I can make a lot more money because I can, I can make things in China or India or that kind of thing. From the perspective of strategic risk and threat, I think the perception for some people has always been there. It's almost like if you worked in the intel community, you know that you have customers who are super interested in intelligence and other ones that really aren't. I remember a survey going around when I was there, and they found that, a lot of the defense leadership was getting most of their news from Fox News and CNN, and then they would list the intelligence briefings below that, right? So it depends on the consumer and it depends on the company. There are some companies that have always been heavily multinational focused. And then there are others that, this is kind of a new frontier for them. And so a lot of it has more to do with the size of the company and the maturity of the company than it does to do with interest versus non-interest. But the big thing, I think the really big thing comes down to risk reward, right? So it's not that companies aren't interested in what's happening internationally. It's how much does it affect them and how much money do they need to put into really understanding that? And is there a payoff for that? Or am I going to be able to just continue to make decisions as I am, and it's not going to make a difference? What's happened in the last 10, 15 years is that the international business environment has gotten a lot more complex. So I think we used to be able to, I would say, count more on a stable U.S. foreign policy and fairly consistent US foreign policy across administrations. So whether it was a Democratic or a Republican administration, there were certain things you could count on in terms of our international trade policy that didn't change dramatically between the mid 90s and say 2016. There was quite a bit of, there was quite a bit of consistency, maybe too much consistency, to be honest.
Yeah.
The upending of the US-China relationship has completely changed the way businesses have to look at the world, because there is so much money invested over there, and every single decision affects that. And so we have a lot more companies now that they don't see it as a luxury anymore to understand what's going on. They have to understand what's going on all of the time.
I see. Yeah, no, that's a great refinement to my clumsy question. So what I heard you saying was, companies have always been interested in the environments that they engage in. That's not a question. But previously, companies primarily looked at the environment as, ways for them to make more money. What are the trends, and how can we get ahead of it, and how can we make more money? They still want to
do very
they
much.
still want to do that, but now both, in addition to that, with today's shifting landscape, as you were just describing, plus technological risks that all companies must have these days, it's now an imperative for them to understand the risks that are, could just like torpedo their brand, or cyber attacks, et cetera. And we had a great conversation. We'll put this in the show notes with a guy named Josh Kerbel from our intelligence community.
I know of Josh.
Do you know Josh? Yeah, great guy.
I know he and I are connected. I think we've talked a couple of times, but we don't know each other well, but I've heard great things about him.
Yeah. He puts it like this. It's like, during the Cold War period, you could almost think about the interactions between the United States and the Soviet Union as like Newtonian physics.
Yeah.
The relationships are relatively well understood. It was a complex world, but not like it is today. And so it's like the difference between something that is merely complex and something which is characterized by complexity, and as you were describing, all these new relationships and technological risks that we have are just overwhelming. And so
but I think it's even down to right now, for example, this thing we've got going back and forth with China. I don't know if you saw the other day, but they've just added export restrictions onto a couple of the key rare earths that they process there. These make up a huge amount of the rare earths that go into the electronics we make every day. So whether you are making cars over there, computers, anything, it's going to have those pieces in it. And what they're saying is not that we're not going to export them, but you now need an export license for them. And so they're starting to put things in place to make that harder, because we have put things in place to make it harder for them to compete technologically on microchips and things like that. So what they're doing is creating some leverage on their side, but every one of those decisions affects how companies operate there and affects their product lines and all of those things. So they have to be keeping track of those very minute decisions, as well as those bigger things like economic espionage and all of that. But we now have to really track every single move that the US government makes and the Chinese government makes.
Right. So I might have gotten us just a little bit waylaid, but let me see if I can get us back on track here a little bit. So do you think you could highlight like some of the top common challenges that you hear companies telling you about, or that you're educating your customers on?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to risk and risk intelligence is that every company has a different set of risks, and every company has a different sort of risk register in terms of what are their big things that are really going to have a material impact on the company. And this is important, because when you think about risk to the government, you think about national security, right? Companies don't think like that. They think about the safety of their people and their assets, and they think about what's going to keep the company running, what's going to keep money coming in to keep the company running. And so the risks are different for every one of them because they're all doing different things, right? But the US-China relationship is at the top of the list for most companies in terms of geopolitics. There is nothing more existential when you look at our national economy and how tied it is to China. But for each and every company that has exposure there, it is at the base of their supply chain. So a lot of companies right now are diversifying to other places, whether that's Vietnam, whether that's India, whether that's Central America, and that's a good thing, but it's expensive. But on Saturday this week, the new espionage law came into effect, or the changes to the espionage law in China. So they're also grappling with how safe is it for us to continue to have expats in these countries. Or in this country, and how safe is it for our local employees to do the work that they've been doing? Because now almost anything that they do could be classified as a national security issue. So whether that's developing technology, whether that's looking at sort of competitive advantages, things like that, everything that they do could potentially be classified as espionage in some way or another because the law is so broad. So that's a big one. Another big one is still Russia-Ukraine. While the immediate tempo of that has simmered down a little bit in terms of the impact on companies, the upheaval last year with all of these companies leaving Russia was a huge bottom line impact for hundreds of companies, both in the US and abroad. But there's also the spillover risk into other parts of Eastern Europe, and that especially with the bizarre events a couple of weeks ago with Prigozhin and in the Wagner Group, there's still a lot going on there that is a very serious risk to the companies that are working there. But more importantly, the broader impact that Russia has had on the economy of Europe, on the economy of the US, the inflation issues, the amount of raw materials and raw materials manufacturing that comes out of Russia, the issues with wheat and food prices. So that has been a continuous issue. Energy prices for the last year, that's been huge. And then there's those other issues like climate change and climate legislation. In the United States, we have a red state, blue state issue with ESG issues in general that's creating huge risks for companies. You want to talk to BlackRock for a couple of minutes, they'll tell you how.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. BlackRock, Disney, any of those companies will tell you about how much the ESG issues have become a major problem for them, both politically and, economically. So yeah, ESG is because ESG has become.
Yeah. Do you think you could take just like a small step back and just give a quick 101 on what it is? Yeah.
Sorry. So ESG is short for environmental, social, and governance issues. So that is everything from your policies around climate change to your policies around diversity and inclusion, and then governance. So how do you actually manage all of those issues within your company? How does that affect your bottom line? Are you sourcing from companies that have proper human rights policies, that have proper environmental policies? Like, are you sourcing timber from the Amazon illegally? Those types of things. So all of those issues kind of get wrapped up into this ESG label. But the impact to companies like, for example, energy companies has been huge in the last few years, because suddenly investors are saying, we don't want to invest in companies that produce fossil fuels anymore, for example. And that has hurt energy producers in places like Texas. And so I think it was last year, kind of year before, the governor in Texas really started to kind of take issue with this and say, well, if you're going to come and work in our state, you're not going to hurt the energy companies that, that we are, that make up our economy. And so they started putting rules into place about, if a company is going to work with the state government of Texas, they cannot enforce certain ESG policies about who they invest in and that kind of thing. And so that has started to spread to other states, other red states, so Florida, places like that. And so there are all measures of complexity for companies now to handle, because they can't even handle the United States as one sort of regulatory framework. They have to think about it right down to the state level, and sometimes even the local municipality, in terms of what policies they can have there versus what policies they can have in another state. And so ESG issues they're big across the board, but then we also have legislation coming down the pike in places like Europe that, in fact, just recently passed, that basically you have to be able to account for, going back to 2020, anything in your supply chain that had a human rights impact or environmental impact, adverse human rights or environmental impact. And so companies have that to grapple with on top of, all of the other issues that are facing them.
My goodness. Yeah, that's a
Very
lot.
complex environment.
Yeah, very, very much so. You didn't mention this, but I'm curious if this comes up in your conversations. Are you and your customers familiar with the United States international traffic in arms regulations as well, like ITAR? Is that familiar
Yep.
to you?
Well, I'm familiar with them. It's not something that's come up a lot in a business context, but yeah, I'm definitely familiar with it.
Yeah. My rough understanding of it is that the U.S. is interested to be sure that technology which is developed in the United States is properly accounted for, or not accidentally made available to state and non-state actors that would use it to
Them the wrong way.
yeah,
Yep.
boomerang it on us. And
Yep.
I would suspect that many of your customers have government contracts as well, or doing some government work, and that kind of thing would also be yet another thing that they have to maneuver in order to keep pursuing their goals and competing in their various different spaces.
Definitely on the
Yeah.
technology side, we have we have a lot of tech companies. We have the dual use technologies issue. So any kind of technology that could be used or weaponized, and this gets really interesting, right, when you start talking about social media and things like that. There's definitely that. And then, of course, some of those companies do, contract with the Defense Department and places like that. So there are definitely, in fact, that's been an issue for companies. If you think about Google a couple of years ago with, I think it was Project Maven, where they had a project they were working on for defense that a bunch of the employees internally revolted over and said, we don't think Google should be working on this. So yeah, it's a very complex environment when it comes to these types of issues.
Yeah, for sure. So you've seen, both sides here, from within the government and now in the private sector. What are your thoughts on ways that let's just say free societies, governments in charge of free societies, so not just the U.S. but other Western governments. What are your thoughts on ways that government can synergize more with private industry regarding threat intelligence and risk?
Yeah, I was really close to this issue when I was still at ConocoPhillips. I did a lot of basically free consulting for the government on on how the government could work better with the private sector. And, at one point came in and briefed General Hayden on the Arab Spring and how the private sector managed the Arab Spring versus how the government did, and, working with social media and intel and that kind of thing. Did a lot of work with ODNI and DHS as well. And, at the time it was a pretty nascent effort. The government does do really, really well working with the private sector through OSAC. I would say is by far their most successful venture in terms of working with the private sector. They've done an amazing job of bringing together organizations and helping them overseas through this organization, through the State Department. the other arms of government, I think, are often hampered by a couple of things. One is that sometimes the priorities don't match up. And sometimes that's because the government is focused on US citizens only, whereas multinationals have to think across countries and across, right? I've got personnel in Ireland, I've got personnel in the UK, I've got personnel in Singapore. I have to think about all of their well-being, not just the people who are American citizens. And so sometimes there's an issue there. I think the government's approach to classified information has to change dramatically in order for the government to adapt to the environment that we live in now. And, we've been beating this drum for years.
What does that look like to you,
Right.
especially somebody who has obviously been involved in the world of classified material? So
it's difficult.
What do you think?
Yeah, it's really hard. And, there are no like super easy solutions to this. But what it comes down to is that a lot of time the government is really distracted by information that they think is secret. That it turns out was actually, in the Washington Post 2 days before. There are often times, there's a disconnect between what people think they're seeing in the IC and what people are seeing on the outside, that some of that gap could be better sort of narrowed by more frequent conversations between the private sector and the government. Now, that said, there are people that go out and do that all the time. And I think it's feeding that information back into the government in a more in a more effective manner, because it goes into this organization, it goes into that organization. It's nothing new, honestly. It's exactly the same problems we've always had with having this giant bureaucracy. I think the Intel community is probably too large, and you've something like 18,000, 20,000 US analysts. That was a number I heard years ago. I don't know how many there are now, but then you've also got all the contract analysts at all the defense, and there's a lot of duplication there, and there's a lot of kind of communication gaps. Now, that said, how you translate that to the private sector, do you start giving intelligence analysts that are working in companies a full clearance? Because what they give them right now is, if you have a critical infrastructure nexus, according to the government, then they will give you a secret level clearance, which really only means that you can go to briefings and have them give you a secret level briefing. For anyone who's worked on the high side, it's not terribly useful. But it's something. I know TSA and the FAA do a really good job with the airlines in terms of working very directly with them. And the Department of Energy and DHS and some of the other organizations do a pretty good job with the energy companies and groups like that. But I think there's a lot more that could be done on that if they could figure out a way to, to provide these analysts more information that they could work with on a day-to-day basis. Now, how that works in practice, I'd leave that to somebody else. But I do think that there could be more and better communication. But I will say, because that all sounded hypercritical, that we've come quite a long way since when I started back in the early 2000s. There's been a huge change. But I think that the biggest hurdle the government has is adapting to how fast things are changing. And even companies struggle to keep up with that. But the government really has just so many bureaucratic hurdles to being able to adapt to technology and all of those things that, I think in some cases it's starting to hurt us as a country.
I'd like to pivot the conversation a bit, if we may, Meredith. And so we had a fantastic podcast with a fellow named Sean McFate. It was probably about a year ago, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes as well. But one of the things that Sean has done some thinking about is, how the geopolitical landscape is potentially shifting even more dramatically than the things that you've been describing. And so these kinds of changes may still be like a couple of decades off, but conceivably, some of the really large companies that are engaged in the world now, Amazon, Google, Alphabet, even Exxon, Chevron, these huge companies, Alibaba, right? But potentially these organizations, they could become their own, countries, if you will, except there's not a geographic connection. It's more of like a conceptual or a cyber kind of a context. But anyway, I'm curious if you and your colleagues have grappled with these kinds of dynamics where companies have to have their own like government and diplomatic engagement infrastructure globally, just like a country would.
Yeah, absolutely. For some companies, it's always been this way. So if you're an energy company, for example, you are going out to different countries and negotiating for their natural resources. The US is one of the only places in the world that you can own the oil, right? That you can own the resources on your property. Everywhere else, this is a natural resource that belongs to the government. So people like, Rex Tillerson might have seemed like a really weird choice for Secretary of State, but Rex Tillerson, by the time he became Secretary of State, had probably talked to every head of government in the world.
Right.
Because they were going out and negotiating and working with these governments. And so in some industries, this has always been the case. The last 10 years, companies have really bumped up against countries like China and places like that, where they have started to demand that these companies, address their country and talk about their country almost the same way that a country would, right? So back in 2018-ish, 2017, the government of China started saying to the airlines and to the hotels, you will not work in China if you do not start calling Taiwan and Hong Kong part of China, right? You cannot have a separate website for them. You cannot have a separate, they have to be considered part of China. Now that's really diplomatically tricky if you're working in both of those places, right? A whole bunch of companies, kind of got thrown under the bus during the Hong Kong thing because either a prominent employee said something on social media that upset the Chinese government. There was the manager for I want to say it was the Houston Rockets, that comment about Hong Kong, and suddenly the whole of the NBA is in trouble with the Chinese government. Yesterday or the day before, Vietnam banned the Barbie movie of all things because the map, and this is intentional, right? The map has a 9-dash line on it. Now the map is not even a real map. It's this messed up, like goofy looking map, but off the side of this weirdly drawn Asia, there's a 9-dash line, very deliberately with 9 dashes on it.
This is in the movie.
This is in the movie, and this is not the first time this has happened. There was another one a while back, but some of the big movie studios started producing movies with Chinese movie with Chinese movie studios a while back. And those studios, one of the insistent points is that China has to be represented the way China wants it represented. And so the Barbie movie was banned from Vietnam, and I think the Philippines is looking at banning it as well. But this kind of thing has been happening for the last 10, 15 years. But political risk itself has always been a thing. And so companies have always had a government affairs group, to deal with things like expropriation out of Venezuela. The idea that corporations could govern themselves, I think is probably a little more far-fetched in terms of like being a sovereign company or country, because all of the documentation that makes you a business comes from legitimate governments. That's what legitimizes your existence as a business, vice a drug cartel or something like that, right? That's what legalizes you. So whether you're, so for example, we have 4 different entities. We have an entity in the US, we have one in in the UK, one in Ireland, one in Singapore, and each one of those entities is governed by the governments there. And so for a corporation to become a sovereign entity is probably not on the cards anytime soon. But what Sean was talking about, and I haven't heard the podcast, so I don't want to speak out of turn here.
Sure.
But this idea of corporations being part of a governing body, that I have heard that theory before. There's some of that comes out of Silicon Valley and places like that. There's a whole group of people that think that there's sort of this corporatist philosophy. I would in a more comical sense kind of liken it to By and Large, that was in the movie WALL-E. Do you remember that movie?
I did not see that one.
Okay, well, you should go watch it now, because it will to you a lot like a certain very large company that I won't name, but you'll be able to pick it out immediately. But the whole world is governed basically by this corporation. And so there are definitely theories that national governments are not equipped for the internet age, because you have these big groups of people that come together above nation state sort of loyalties, and that's definitely created problems in
and even the probably the strong desire, if not this is already happening, for companies, organizations to go on the attack. You're going to cyber attack us? Okay, well, here you go, right back at you. And it's I suppose you could argue it's like self-defense.
Well, you remember the Sony hack in 2014 over the movie that talked about Kim Jong-il.
Yes,
right? And they shut down, like they bricked all the computers at Sony, and the president of the United States had to get involved in that. And that was probably the first time that the US government looked at an attack on a corporation and said, do we consider this a national security issue? And it is, right? Because when you shut down a multi-billion-dollar company, that's people's livelihoods, that's your economy. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that nation states get involved in those. And certainly there is a lot of back and forth between the US government and private companies on cyber issues because of that.
Right. And no, that's a very legitimate argument, even though you certainly can't credibly think of the entertainment industry as critical infrastructure. It's not the same as dams and the health sector and the energy sector and all 16 other sectors. But just like you said, if it's a big enough organization, then people's livelihoods are put at risk. And it also just goes to the whole point that the favorable position that the U.S. has enjoyed, and Australia and other countries have enjoyed, with these oceans that insulate us from direct ground attack, that those buffers are wiped away.
Exactly. And I would argue that the entertainment industry is critical infrastructure, because because any industry that commands as much money as the entertainment industry does, right? If you looked at the billions and billions of dollars that accounts for in our economy, if you took that away, that would have an existential impact on the livelihoods of so many Americans that it would definitely affect the national economy. And so I think you have to look at it from a little bit less of a bridges and that kind of thing, and look at it more from the perspective of what share of the economy is at risk here. But also your entertainment companies like Disney and companies like that are tied up in all kinds of different parts of industry, whether it's they own ESPN, they own ABC, they own a huge amount of the news infrastructure as well. Right? And so there are a lot of arguments to be made that those industries actually are part of our critical infrastructure.
Right. And I could also imagine organizations, Disney and others like you were just describing, like actively pursuing a resiliency agenda, which is very deliberately looking to what's the word in investing, diversify
Oh, yeah, yeah.
their engagement model. So it's not just we make movies, that's what we do, but I'm sure companies like Disney and others are pursuing like lots of like research which is dual use, right? That
Right,
would have
for
many
sure.
other purposes beyond just the entertainment industry, thereby making their business model more resilient. And like you said, well, is Disney a critical infrastructure company? Well, some could say yes, but well, not so fast.
We want to talk about employment, it certainly is. But the other thing about those companies is that, Disney has a bajillion cruise ships, for example.
Mm.
But Disney is also the only example that I can think of a company that actually does have some sovereign privileges. So, and this goes back to the ESG conversation. So
Mm.
I don't know if you have followed Disney in Florida over the last year, but they have been basically at war with Ron DeSantis and over the, I wouldn't say at war, but definitely at odds with DeSantis over the Don't Say Gay law. So
Mhm,
when
mhm.
and when they went to legislate that, the CEO of Disney came out and said, because he was also getting a lot of pressure internally, and said, "Hey, we really don't agree with this law. It's not good for our people, and you have a lot of LGBTQ within the entertainment industry, that kind of thing, right?" And the state of Florida basically said, "Well, then fine, we aren't going to give you the economic privileges that we do here in Florida." Well, one of those economic privileges is that Disney basically has jurisdiction within its parks in Orlando and surrounds for all of the emergency services, like all of the things that they do within those parks that like a normal city municipality would govern. They have their own governance over that.
Mm.
And basically what the state of Florida has said is we're taking that away. And that will completely change their ability to run their operations within their parks. And so they actually do have a little tiny bit of sovereignty there that's at risk because of this issue that they've had with the government. So
Mhm.
so that kind of ties two topics together for you, but kind of interesting stuff.
Yeah, wow. What an amazing, interesting space you are swimming in here today. I'd like to close out, if we may, Meredith. I ask a couple of questions typically. One, so do you have any thoughts about a research topic that an interested student might explore that is related to the kinds of stuff that we've been talking about?
Oh yeah, I mean tons of them. In fact, the company sovereignty question would be a fascinating one, wouldn't it,
Mm.
to look at? But honestly, right now, anything to do with how Western businesses go forward in China and Russia, in places like that, where we are looking at drastically different systems of governance, and what we have now as a sort of global competition for how things should be done, which is what's sort of emerging between China and the West. Is here is the way that we do things, and here's the way that you do things, and how businesses go forward in this sort of dual structured economy, because that's not what we were pushing for in the early 2000s when we were letting China into the World Trade Organization, right? It was all about liberalization and democracies and all of that, and now we're moving in a totally different direction, and the same with Russia.
Excellent, excellent. And then finally, do you have a book suggestion or some other online resource that is also related to the kinds of stuff we've been talking about?
Yeah, there's several. When it comes to understanding political issues within companies, Condoleezza Rice wrote a good book. If you do what I do, you'll read it and go, well, yeah, this is what we've been doing for the last 15 years. But if you don't do what I do, and you're interested in it, I think it's a really good sort of college level book on how companies are bumping up against political risk and reputation risk in this sort of new technology world. And she wrote this before AI, but that book is simply called Political Risk, and it's Condoleezza Rice and Amy Ziegert. On the technology side, if you're struggling at all to understand AI and some of its both, sort of upsides and downsides, there is a book by the former head of Google X, Mo Gadwat, that talks about AI and some of the challenges that it poses, and basically how society needs to think about AI as we're moving forward. And unfortunately, the title of the book has just escaped me, but it's I can send it to you.
Yeah, we'll look it up and get it into the show notes. Okay, well, so excellent suggestions. Fascinating discussion, obviously very important and relevant to all players and stakeholders in today's global environment. And with that, Meredith Wilson, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you. This was a very fascinating talk and very interesting questions.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.